The left has ceded the space on anti-Semitism, and the right has smartly and strategically filled that void. That's one of the big takeaways from award-winning British progressive journalist Rachel Shabi's new book, Off-White, The Truth About Antisemitism. In it, she also takes on the quote-unquote new anti-Semitism pushed by supporters of Israel to try and silence and demonize supporters of Palestine. And the author herself, Rachel Shabi, joins me now. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Congratulations on the book. It's a very powerful book, a very much needed book. So I'm going to start with the kind of obvious questions that people have when you bring up the subject of anti-Semitism. How do you define anti-Semitism?
Well, that's part of the problem, isn't it? That it's become this huge battleground. And I think the first thing to say about the political and media conversation we're having about anti-Semitism and the way that it's defined therein is a complete dumpster fire.
Yes.
Right? It's producing less clarity, less understanding of anti-Semitism, and at the same time it is dividing and tearing apart progressives. All of which is to say that I think that anti-Semitism and its misdefinition and its misuse in our media and politics is become a wedge issue. The right wing have taken anti-Semitism and turned it into a wedge issue in politics, used it to divide, used it to shut down not just Palestinian voices, which we more urgently than ever need to hear from right now, but also more widely to shut down critical race theory, to attack Black Lives Matter, to attack anti-racism itself. Yeah. And so the question for me in writing this book was, how do we reconstitute the progressive anti-racist left, which wants to make the struggle against anti-Semitism part of the wider anti-racist movement, but also be morally coherent and unified against the various challenges and attacks that we're facing from an increasingly organized and politically salient right wing.
So there's a lot there and a lot to unpack, and the book unpacks a lot of it, and that's why it's such an important book. But forgive me if I'm that interviewer who does a follow-up and say, well, you didn't actually answer my question, which is there a definition of anti-Semitism that you favor, that you use, that when people say to you, well, I don't know what it means when people say you're anti-Semitic, what do you normally say to them?
So there's a couple of things that I say, and yes, you notice that I didn't directly answer the question. First of all, anti-Semitism is hatred of Jewish people for being Jewish people, either individually or collectively. Secondly, anti-Semitism is structured as a conspiracy about power. That's what it is. It sets up a persecuted minority group, privileges some of them and elevates some of them for the benefit of then using them as a punch bag, as a scapegoat for when things go wrong. And those, whatever those things, they can be anything. You know, Jewish people through history have been blamed for all kinds of things, capitalism and socialism, global conspiracies, puppet mastering various plots to undermine Western societies, but that's the purpose of it. It is used by power to create a conspiracy about power in order to deflect attention in times of crisis.
A useful scapegoat over the centuries.
A useful scapegoat.
When you say, and I'll pull the book up here because it stands out, when you say Jewish people, it's in the title of the book, are off-white, what do you mean by that?
Jewish people are showing up as essentially a category error around whiteness, in the sense that historically Jewish people were not considered to be white. Jewish people were racialized as a not white minority. Christian Europeans cast Jews as, you know, demonic, alleged Christ killers, but also the other, the foil against which Christian Europeans define themselves. In the post-World War, post-Second World War era, Jewish people became increasingly absorbed into the structures of whiteness, absorbed into, you know, a Western value system. That happened in a pronounced and accelerated way in the US, where you see, by and large, Jewish people are, you know, mostly integrated and absorbed. But the fact remains that Jewish people have been not white for longer than they've been white. And so what do you do with this minority that is still racialized as a minority, that isn't structurally discriminated against in the way that black and brown people are? We don't have the structures of the state directed at us, discriminating against us. And so we are not white, but we're not white. And so this category of off-white, but actually what it does, and when you look at the history of anti-Semitism and racism, what it shows more than anything, this category of Jewish people, are you white, are you not white, is that the whole construct of white is bunk.
Yes.
It's an invented category. And so what Jewish people not fitting into that tells us again and again is that this was a category constructed, not by Jewish people, but mostly by Christian Europeans.
And also a reflection of power and who's in power.
Yes.
What do you say to a black or brown person who says, I accept that anti-Semitism is a form of racism. I accept that Jews face discrimination, persecution, conspiracy theories. But when I talk, and I'm saying a hypothetical black or brown person says, when I talk about white privilege, I'm including Jews in that. Is that fair? Would you, when we talk about white, which is something we talk about these days, white privilege, does that cover Jewish communities in the West?
I think yes and no, again. And I think that again, it presents that category error. A lot of Jewish people that I spoke with would express discomfort, not just with the label applied to them of whiteness, which of course, by the way, you know, there are black Jews, there are Jews of colour, there are Jews from the Middle East. Most of my extended family would certainly not categorised as or fit into the category of white. But it's not a yes-no question. And so absolutely, Jewish people, by being absorbed into Western power structures of whiteness, are part of the structure of upholding it and maintaining it in some way, and get to do that in a way, you know, that passing, that white presenting thing is something that black and brown people will never be able to do, right? There's no capacity to step into that power structure of whiteness. But again, I think it's very complicated, especially if you're looking at the idea that actually privilege is part of the way anti-Semitism operates. White nationalists, for instance, will create this hashtag called Jewish privilege, in which they've packed all kinds of conspiracy theories. Part of the reason white nationalists get so upset with Jewish people is precisely that they're, you know, they pass as white and therefore are operating as, you know, these fifth columnists who are, you know, allegedly trying to undermine societies from within.
You mention Brian Klug in the book, who wrote, when anti-Semitism is everywhere, it is nowhere. And you go on to say that prolific misuse of the term is stripping it of any meaning. Is that the reason you wrote this book?
It's one key reason. And we've seen that go into overdrive in the last year, right? So everybody who's in some way crying out for the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, in this genocidal war to end, everybody, whether that's the UN, whether that's British pop singers, whether that's Swedish climate campaigners, whether it's people going on a march, whether it's students at a campus protest, everybody is accused of being anti-Semitic when they try to do that. And so the effect has been not only to silence and chill speech on Palestine at this urgent moment, which is bad enough, but it's also completely degraded the term. It's become this sort of slogan on a lingo bingo scorecard, right? You know, has Israel said that the people killed in the airstrike were Hamas? Has Israel said that Hamas is hiding in schools?
Yes.
Have they called it anti-Semitic yet, right? It's one of those things.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the end result of that has been to degrade our appreciation of anti-Semitism to such an extent that you now see some variations of, on social media, people saying something like, if you haven't been accused of anti-Semitism, you're not doing Palestine solidarity.
Yeah, it's like a badge of honor for a lot of people.
Badge of honor, which is absolutely...
And that's very worrying because anti-Semitism is real, it's historic, it can destroy people's lives. But by being misused or degraded, as you put it, by the Israeli government, it opens the door for people just to dismiss the concept as a whole.
It opens the door for people to dismiss it. You know, if everybody is being, if all your friends and all your colleagues are being hit by the same hammer, then everyone's going to start to look like a nail. And the trouble is, as you rightly say, that anti-Semitism genuinely is on the rise. At the moment, we're seeing alarming levels globally, from, you know, attacks on Jewish daycare centres in Canada to women being stabbed in France.
But even with that, again, there's been so much conflation because clearly we've seen attacks on Jewish daycare centres, Jewish synagogues, people who look visibly Jewish. And yet the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League in the US, recently put out a report on anti-Semitism saying there's been a 200% rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the past year. And you think, wow, that's bad, 200%. But then when you look at the report, the numbers have gone up because they redefined anti-Semitism to include more anti-Israel acts than before. And yet we saw the media uncritically parrot those numbers. A headline in the BBC read, anti-Semitic incidents in US surged to record high, even though the BBC piece, when you read it, mentions that the actual report has redefined it. How do we call out the rise in anti-Semitism, especially on the left, especially in progressive pro-Palestinian spaces, call out the genuine rise in anti-Semitism without endorsing this idea that, oh yes, if you're anti-Israel, that's being lumped into the category as well? It's really problematic.
You're absolutely right. It's really difficult. It's asking us to do several slightly potentially contradictory things all at the same time. One of the things is to look at the available data and look at it properly. So, you know, when I look at the UK equivalent, when you look at the levels of anti-Semitism in the UK, it does include things like physical and verbal assault. The numbers do include things like, you know, having bottles and bricks thrown at people who look or are perceived to look Jewish. And so, you know, we have to take that on its face. I think at the same time, you do have organizations who are trying to facilitate this ability. So things like the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which is hundreds of scholars, Jewish and other scholars, who have tried to put together definitions that allow for genuine criticism of Israel and give guidance of when that does and doesn't shade.
That's a counter to the IHRA definition, which many people feel is too broad in its definition, in its examples of what could be anti-Semitism, including a lot of Israel references.
Well, even some of the authors of the IHRA have said, actually, this wasn't intended as a legal measure by which to, you know, chill free speech, which is effectively what happened. And you're absolutely right, JDA is a response to that.
When I look at the anti-Semitism debate right now, I feel like I am kind of stuck between these kind of extremes of people saying it's all fake, it's all just used by Israel to kind of shut people up. And then on the other side, everyone's anti-Semitic. Ireland is anti-Semitic, the UN is anti-Semitic, the ICC is anti-Semitic. I mean, I do genuinely feel these days that the Israeli government has done more to undermine the struggle against anti-Semitism than any other actor on the planet. If I was Jewish, I'm not, I'm Muslim, but if I was Jewish, I'd be very upset that there was a foreign government that was taking a really serious issue that I care about and just throwing it about for political gain.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of Jewish people, me included, and I'm also Israeli born, a lot of people are really furious about that. I think for us, though, as progressives who want to be able to talk about the horrors inflicted upon Palestinian people, who want to tackle racism, who want to tackle Islamophobia and tackle anti-Semitism and see that as all part of a joint struggle. I think for us the question is, what do we create out of that? Because it's not enough for us to be constantly reacting to all the appalling misuses of anti-Semitism that are coming out of the Israeli government. We actually have to define our own response. You know, we have the right wing responding to anti-Semitism by pretending that it's something that it's not, to shut down Palestinian voices and more.
While ignoring their own old school anti-Semitism, which is back. Trump pushes all sorts of anti-Semitic tropes all the time about Jewish power.
It's back with a vengeance. So that's part of the far right.
So what is the left getting wrong?
What's the response? What's the left-wing solution? We're not talking about anti-Semitism at all, except to say these claims of anti-Semitism are fake, which we absolutely should be doing. Those accusations have real and serious repercussions, but it's not enough just to be doing that. We need to be building our own credibility as people who care about and fight against anti-Semitism when we see it, including, as you say, from the right, which is getting worse.
I mean, the right, as you know, deflect and say, how can we be anti-Semitic? We're really pro-Israel. Which has always frustrated me because lots of pro-Israel people are anti-Semitic, right? You can be very, very pro-Israel, as we've seen with European far-right politicians like Marine Le Pen, who's rebranded an anti-Semitic party, saying we're really pro-Israel, which is frustrating. But it also does that conflation between Israel and Jews, which in and of itself is anti-Semitic, right? This is a kind of weird circular position we're in, where people will say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm pro-Israel, even though conflating Israel with Jews is one of the common definitions of anti-Semitism.
100%. So the reason I wrote this book is that it's such a hellscape of contradictory things that seem impossible to unpack. I have a couple of chapters about areas where the left could improve, and then there's actually a couple of chapters dedicated to the far right, because as you say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I like Israel. Here's a picture of me shaking hands with Netanyahu is a classic thing that the far right does. And we have to understand that as a deliberate rehabilitation mechanism for the far right, whether it's Marine Le Pen, whether it's Viktor Orban in
Elon
Hungary.
Musk went straight to Israel after he did that tweet where he said, endorsed some anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Where he said, you are exactly right. Then he popped off to Israel and suddenly everyone loved him again.
He popped off to Israel. The Israeli Diaspora Affairs Minister, who's responsible also for dealing with anti-Semitism, Amichai Chikli, says, Elon Musk is right. Soros is a problem.
Yes.
You know, we have someone like
endorsing.
We have someone like Rudy Giuliani, you know, Trump supporter and Roman Catholic, say of Soros a few years ago, well, he's not really Jewish. I'm more Jewish than he is.
Well, the delegitimization of Jewishness in the context of this debate over Israel and anti-Semitism is fascinating. You have Jewish students on college campuses, as you point out in the book, who are not just joining in the protests, but they're doing Jewish rites and rituals in the middle of the encampments. And yet they're being told you're not really Jewish because you don't support Israel, because you've thrown in your lot with these leftists.
So I think one of the most heartening, rare heartening moments in this horrendous year has been to see Jewish students in the UK, in the US, reclaim a Jewish identity that is progressive and is liberal in its values, and reclaim their Judaism, prize it away from a, you know, Israel right or wrong blind support, and actually create our own version of Judaism that is consistent with their progressive values. Just to go back to the far right for a moment, because this is really important, and I think one of the reasons we, the left, have such a hard time is the rank hypocrisy. You can be as anti-Semitic as you like, as long as you're pro-Israel. And we need to understand that those defenders of Jewish people actually don't care about Jewish people at all. Some of them have horrendous Nazi and anti-Semitic, Holocaust revisionist pasts and presents, whether it's Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. They are using a pretend defense of Jewish people, both to rehabilitate their own politics and to mainline their current obsession, which is hating Muslims. And that's why it's really important to unpack what's going on and reject it and actually build a coherent struggle against anti-Semitism that is coherent with our anti-racism.
And you talk about in the book about the role that Christians play in this, right? We talk a lot about Muslims versus Jews, but the most pro-Israeli group in the United States are Christian, white Christian evangelicals, and they're pro-Israel, not because they love Jews, because they think it'll bring Jesus back quicker and then Jews will all convert or die. So it's not exactly a pro-Jewish position when you delve into the hardcore theology, which I find ironic. Do you think we've given a pass? Do you think, sometimes I feel like Muslims and Jews have fallen into a trap that a third community has set for us?
I think that's a really good way of putting it. And by the way, the whole thing is giving off very colonial divide and rule vibes. It is essentially a reproduction of some common themes, and that sort of divisiveness, my family's from Iraq, is very much the way that, you know, the British Mandate Palestine and Mandate Iraq operated, also the French in North Africa. Part of the way that the West has brought Jewish people into whiteness is with this invented category of a Judeo-Christian heritage. It's not a thing, right? There's no such thing as a Judeo-Christian heritage, not religiously, not culturally. Everybody talks about it. Yes, the far right talk about it all the time because it means they can be Islamophobic, but everyone, you know, the British Tony Blair, 2 German chancellors spoke about Germany being founded on the basis of Judeo-Christian values, which is quite a statement when you think
have, no self-awareness.
No self-awareness. You're with a straight face, you're going to say that. And the thing that's irksome about that is not just that it's a constructed category that is much more about the Western Christian part of the equation and what they need out of it than what Jewish people are getting out of it. It's also a way to demonize Muslims and Islam, but it's also, it erases the centuries-old hyphenated category of Judeo-Islamic, which is a far more meaningful religious, cultural hyphen It's been completely disappeared.
It's a very good point. And as you said earlier, a lot of the alliance today between right-wing Jews and right-wing Christians is about being Islamophobic.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, that's why Wilders loves Netanyahu, not because they both see Islam as the threat to Israel and to the Netherlands. You said earlier, we talked about, we touched on this idea of, people endorsing Israel as part of the protection. A lot of people will say that that is where the anti-Semitism debate should be. A lot of right-wing Jewish groups will say that the litmus test should be Israel. And I've done a lot of debates on anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
For my sins, I debated Douglas Murray this summer.
Yes.
And one of the things, the arguments that the other side say, and I wanted to hear your take on this, is of course it's anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist, because you're saying the world's only Jewish state should not exist. That means you're anti-Jewish. What's your response to that?
Look, I think that does criticism of Israel sometimes shade into and slip into anti-Semitism? Yes. We need to be vigilant about that. It is inconceivable when you've articulated that anti-Semitism is a conspiracy about power. It's inconceivable that a state that is a Jewish collective, that has, the largest concentration of Jewish people in the world, and that is actually militarily very strong and supported by the greatest powers in the world, it's inconceivable that criticism of it wouldn't sometimes slip into anti-Semitism. So doing that test should be a reflex for the progressive left. However, the idea that Israel is being uniquely singled out is just bunk. I mean, it's just not true. That would only be true if you said only Israel, only the Jewish people cannot have self-determination. Everyone else can. Catalans, Kurds, Palestinians, every other ethnic minority that wants to have self-determination can have it. Only the Jews cannot have it.
But that's their argument. They claim that that's what anti-Zionists are saying, but it's not true.
Who is saying that? Who is actually saying that? The other thing is that there's actually very good reasons why people in the West would be looking at Israel, because it is an ally of the West. It is the,
self-proclaimed outpost of the West.
Self-proclaimed, yes, which was
in the Eurovision Song Contest.
In the Eurovision Song, but actually did this sort of, we are all fighting the same war. We are the villa in the jungle, as previous Israeli Prime Minister has said. We are the front line of civilization, which obviously is red meat to the far right and to the Muslim haters, right? But the whole idea that people are upset because Israel is serially violating international law and persecuting, subjugating, and oppressing Palestinians. That's what this is about.
But what if you go beyond that and you say, even if they're not subjugating Palestinians, even if they end the occupation, I don't support a two-state solution, many people would say, many Palestinians would say, I support one state, not a Jewish state, one binational, multi-faith, multi-race democracy. A lot of people would say that's anti-Semitic because you're denying the Jews a state of their own. How do you respond to that line of argument?
I think that there is a lot of difficulty in this question, and I honestly think that the left could do better and be a lot clearer in their approach to this, because if they're not, then
they're feeding,
the right wing gets to...
A lot of the discussion on the left, I worry about, especially you talk to young activists or people who, perhaps there's a failure of education, but I feel like a lot of people, even in the Muslim community, and I've spoken and written about this, where there's a lot of well-intentioned people, but they cross over into tropes, perhaps unknowingly. And it makes it sound like it sounds like a cop-out, like I'm defending racists, but there are many people I know who you just talk to them and say, look, this is how it's heard by a Jewish person, what you just said. And then they realize it. They may not realize it to begin with. And I know Ilhan Omar famously with the whole Benjamins got into all of it. And she came out with a very, very powerful statement, which local Jewish communities appreciated. She said, look, that wasn't my intent. I hadn't heard it that way. I grew up not knowing about some of this stuff, the way it's presented. There are tropes. Look, at the end of the day, there is a pro-Israel lobby in America that's very, very powerful. Anyone who says otherwise is an idiot or a liar. At the same time, there are also long-standing tropes about Jews controlling the world. You have to navigate between those two things, and some people don't always do it successfully, and they get branded as anti-Semitic.
So Ilhan Omar gave a textbook example of how to handle it. We all can learn from the way that she dealt with that. She rephrased her statement. She did not dilute in any way her criticism of Israel. in that moment, but she reframed it so that it wouldn't be potentially heard as anti-Semitic. You're absolutely right. We're being asked to do a lot of things all in one go. I do think that there is something here about, it's not just education about anti-Semitism, though that is key. There's also something going on here where, you know, if you look at social media and also offline, the willingness for people, absolutely there's an Israel lobby, just like there is lots of other powerful lobbies.
Gun lobby, big pharmaceuticals.
Our argument here is with the political interference in democracy, which is distorting, no matter where it comes from. But when you look at the conversation offline and online, how often do we see an analysis of the geopolitical goings-on with the West's support for Israel versus, oh, Israel is controlling and dictating the media and the governments of the world. And by the way, Joe Biden, who will be remembered as Genocide Joe, he's actively feeding this with this whole narrative, this whole year. I can't do anything.
Yes, agreed.
If only I could do something. It's like you are the...
Which does, yes, it feeds into the idea that Israel controls America rather than America has its own strategic interest in which Israel plays a good role.
And that's the important thing. The US, just like the UK, have many reasons. We can argue with their reasons, but their establishment appraisal is Israel is an ally, geopolitically a foothold, military security,
again, just to
intelligence.
be devil's advocate though, it doesn't help when you have AIPAC goes around saying, ha ha ha, look at who we defeated. They literally put out ads bragging about, we put all this money and we defeated these people, which only helps anti-Semites who go, see, they're admitting it, right? So it's like, some of us are in the middle going...
Yeah, so we're going to have to do this work despite the bad faith actors and not in reaction to the bad faith actors.
What do you do about people who are not bad faith actors but have been, I don't know how to put this sensitively, brainwashed, indoctrinated? A lot of, I would argue, a lot, not all, of course, because we've seen a lot of Jewish students on campuses fight back, but a lot of young Jewish Americans are, from a very young age, exposed only to pro-Israel information, trips to Israel, birthright, etc., and are very sensitive about criticism of Israel. And, you know, my friend Dr. Suzanne Barakat, whose family were infamously murdered in Islamophobia hate crime in Chapel Hill in 2015, just recently gave a speech at a conference of schools, private schools. She talked about genocide in Israel. She talked about why she thinks Zionism is a form of colonialism. People are entitled to disagree with that. But apparently Jewish people in the audience felt hurt. They felt it was racist. They felt it was anti-Semitic. And the New York Times and New York Post all ran pieces attacking Suzanne Barakat, attacking the conference apologia. You look at stuff like that, then you can understand why people get very cynical about this stuff because they couldn't identify a single anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish statement. Even the New York Times coverage opened with anti-Semitic claims, but then she said anti-Israel things. So it's like people in the audience felt like they were being targeted. What do you do about that? Am I not supposed to say something's a genocide because you hear it as anti-Semitic? Not you, but a person hears it. What do you do in that situation?
There's a couple of things to say. First of all, again, we need to do this work despite all of that and not in reaction to it. We have to create our own narrative that is stronger and more morally coherent and builds a wider, more inclusive movement that more people want to join. So we have to do that despite all this bad faith. And the derailing effect of it. And that's really hard. The second thing is, I talk about this a little bit in my book, in that, you know, I wasn't, you know, my family's Iraqi Jewish, I'm Israeli born, but I didn't pass through that narrative of Zionism. That wasn't part of my upbringing. But it is, you're right, it is the way that most Jewish people, you know, or a lot of Jewish people are raised. And so we have this reality where it may actually not be bad faith. It may be that Jewish people, because they have been raised to identify Israel as a defining feature of their identity, if they hear Israel attacked, they hear their identity attacked. Now, what's our response? Well, first of all, not to laugh and sneer at it. And secondly, to point out how and why it's wrong. But we can do that in a way that builds inclusion rather than you know, more polarization.
Because there aren't easy parallels. Like, I'm a Muslim. You can criticize Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan. I don't care. I'll join you in doing so. Like, it's not part of my identity in the same way that Israel has become part of the identity of a lot of Jewish communities.
And therefore it is different. Therefore it is different.
And then you get into the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitism. Well, if you're a Zionist and a Jew, then I'm criticizing both. It's very tricky. But I'm glad you've written a book to try and unpack some of it. It's a great book. I urge people to read the book. One last question. We're about to have the most anti-Semitic president since Richard Nixon back in the White House, a man who hangs around with open white supremacists, who hosted a Holocaust denier at his home for dinner, talks about American Jews with some of the oldest tropes in the book. How worried are you about the rise of anti-Semitism in places like the US over the next 4 years?
Extremely worried, not just in the US, but across Europe. When you look at the resurgent far right and their, the pro-Israel anti-Semitism that they're all doing, this flavor is very powerful. It has a lot of traction. It's going to get worse. It's going to get much worse. And it's going to divide us because it's going to be used in service of attacking Islam and it's going to be anti-black and brown people. So we have a lot of work to do. We have to do this because if we don't do it, the far right are going to keep winning because they've discovered this perfect wedge to torpedo and divide our movements. So we're going to have to find a way to talk about anti-Semitism, to reclaim it, to make it part of our conversation that is consistently opposed, Israeli violations up to and including a genocidal war in Gaza, but is also consistently anti-racist, against black and brown people, against Jewish people, and actually has the traction to build a bigger movement that can push back against the resurgent far right.
And that encourages us to stick together, not turn on one another. Because what I say to a lot of my Jewish friends who are kind of hearing the siren calls from the right is, once they're done with the Muslims, they'll be back to you guys. That's the truth, sadly.
That's how it works,
Rachel Shabi, thanks so much for coming on the show. The book is called Off-White, The Truth About Antisemitism. It's a great book.
Thanks for having me on.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.